If you're listening to this right now, there's something you should know first. I am not telling this story because I'm angry. I'm telling it because I lived. They told my family I wouldn't remember anything. They said the medication would blur the edges, erase the middle, leave me with nothing but gaps. They said my body would be here, but I wouldn't be. They were wrong. I remember the exact moment I realized everyone in that room thought I was already gone. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was quiet. And that's what made it terrifying. I was lying in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines that breathed, blinked, and hummed like they'd replaced my own instincts. Tubes ran from places on my body I could no longer feel. My chest rose and fell on a rhythm I didn't control anymore. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak, I couldn't even open my eyes properly. But my mind was awake, sharp, clear enough to notice when the way people spoke around me changed. During the day, doctors talked to me. Nurses explained what they were doing, even if they knew I couldn't answer. Family members spoke carefully, like words themselves were fragile objects that might break me. At night, that stopped. At night, people told the truth. Hospitals after midnight are different places. The lights dim, the footsteps slow, and conversations lose their polish. Everyone thinks the rules loosen when no one is watching. That's when she started standing closer to my bed. At first, I didn't know it was her. I could only sense a presence, a shift in the air, a shadow interrupting the glow of the monitors. Then came the smell of her perfume. Too expensive, too deliberate, completely wrong for a room that smelled like antiseptic and plastic. She didn't touch me yet. She just stared. I know she stared because people breathe differently when they're watching something they think is ending. Slower, heavier, impatient even. Behind her, a few steps back, stood my son. I recognized his breathing immediately. Uneven, shallow, trying to sound calm and failing. "Dad's still heavily sedated," he said quietly, not to reassure her, to reassure himself. If this is your first time hearing a story like this, pause for a second, notice where you're sitting, notice the silence around you. Because what I'm describing didn't happen in some movie. It happened in a room like the one you'd walk past without thinking twice. And this isn't one of those stories where everything explodes at once. This one unfolds slowly, the way real betrayals do. Back then, I didn't know how long I'd been in that bed. Days blurred together. Pain came and went like weather. But my ears never stopped working. That night, I heard my daughter-in-law sigh. Not the kind of sigh you release when you're scared. The kind you make when you're tired of waiting. "You're still breathing," she said, just like that. No anger, no fear, no sadness. An observation. The monitor beside my bed beeped steadily, quietly confirming her statement. My son shifted his weight behind her. I heard the fabric of his jacket move. "They said he wouldn't be aware," he murmured. "He didn't say alive. He said aware." That distinction mattered more than he understood. She leaned closer. Close enough that I felt warmth near my cheek. Close enough that if I could have opened my eyes properly, she would have been all I saw. "You've lived long enough," she whispered. "You don't need to keep fighting." Fight. That word landed harder than anything else. Because from where I was lying, there was no fight left. Just endurance. Just patience. Just listening. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell my son I was still here. That I could hear the hesitation in his voice. That I could hear what he wasn't saying. But my body refused me. You don't realize how heavy silence is until you're trapped inside it. The first time she came that close, I thought it might be a one-time thing. Stress does strange things to people. Grief twists logic. I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. The second night she came again. Same hour, same perfume, same disappointed sigh. This time she didn't bring my son all the way to the bed. He lingered near the door, pretending to check messages on his phone, pretending not to listen. She spoke low, careful. "Things would be easier if this ended naturally," she said. Naturally. As if hospitals were natural places. As if machines didn't already decide more than any of us were willing to admit. "If you're still with me, do me a small favor. Let me know where you're listening from. Your city, your country." Stories like this don't belong to one place, and I've learned that silence looks the same everywhere. And if you want to hear how this ends, not just what she did, but how everything finally caught up to her, make sure you don't miss what comes next. Now listen carefully to this part. On the third night something changed. She didn't speak at first. She reached out. Her fingers brushed against the tubing near my face, the oxygen line that kept my chest rising when it wanted to give up. Her touch wasn't frantic or cruel. It was casual. That was the moment I understood this wasn't a slip. This wasn't grief talking. This was decision. My heart rate ticked upward. just enough for me to notice. The machine responded dutifully, adjusting without drama. Still, no alarms, no witnesses. My son cleared his throat again. She wouldn't do anything, he said, more loudly this time, almost pleading. I don't know if he was trying to convince her or himself. She leaned in and whispered words meant only for someone she believed couldn't hear. Stop pretending, she said, just die quietly. In that moment, I learned something profound. People talk about good and evil like they're loud things, like they announce themselves, like you'd recognize them right away. They don't. They whisper, and they rely on silence to protect them. What my daughter-in-law didn't know, what no one in that room knew yet, was that silence does not mean absence. It means waiting. And I was very, very awake. If you'd met my daughter-in-law the way I did, you wouldn't have believed a word of what I told you later. That's the part that still unsettles me. She didn't arrive in our family with conflict. She arrived with manners. The first time my son brought her home, she shook my hand with both of hers, smiled just long enough to feel respectful, and called me sir. She complimented the house, asked about my health, brought a dessert she said she'd made herself. People like her understand optics. They always do. My son was 31 at the time, old enough to know himself, or so I thought. Quiet, thoughtful, the kind of man who'd always tried to keep peace even as a boy. If two people were arguing in a room, he would naturally drift toward the one who looked like they might lose. That tendency never left him. When his mother died years earlier, something in him softened permanently. He became careful with people's feelings, over-accommodating, afraid, I think, of being the reason someone walked away. So when this woman looked at him like he was the only solid thing in her world, he mistook intensity for love, and I didn't stop it. I remember watching them at the dinner table that first night. She laughed at his jokes before he finished them, touched his arm when he spoke, leaned in when others talked, as if every word belonged only to the two of them. That kind of closeness feels flattering at first, especially to a man who's never needed attention to feel whole. But attention can be a leash if you don't notice when it tightens. At first, nothing seemed wrong. She remembered birthdays. She organized holidays. She spoke beautifully about family values and respect. She also asked a lot of questions, not nosy ones, polite ones. What kind of work did I do? Was the house fully paid off? Had I updated my will recently? She asked them smiling, casually, as if she were making conversation. I didn't think much of it at the time. When you reach a certain age, people talk to you differently. They don't always realize how transparent their curiosity is. Still, I noticed something subtle even then. When I answered, she listened. Not like someone interested in me, like someone filing information away. My son didn't notice, or maybe he did and chose not to see it. They married less than a year later, small ceremony, private. She insisted on handling most of the planning, wanted it simple, controlled, clean. She stood beside him at the altar looking serene, composed and deeply, carefully calm. I remember thinking she looked less like a bride and more like someone assuming a position. After the wedding, things changed quietly. She didn't isolate him immediately. She wasn't foolish enough for that. Instead, she framed distance as efficiency. Your dad's independent, she'd say. He doesn't need us hovering. Let's not bother him with little things. Slowly, I saw my son less. Not sharply, not suddenly, just enough to feel normal. When they did come by, she answered questions for him, finished his sentences, corrected small details he didn't bother arguing over. He let her. That's important. He always let her. If you're listening to this and something about it feels familiar, take note of that feeling. Control rarely announces itself as force. More often, it shows up as convenience. The first time I sensed real tension was over money. Nothing dramatic, just an offhand comment. We were sitting in my living room one afternoon, sunlight cutting through the blinds. She asked how I was managing things since retiring. I told her I was comfortable. Not wealthy, but comfortable enough. She nodded, smiled, then said something that still echoes in my mind. You should make sure everything's clear on paper. You never know what can happen. My son stared at the floor. I laughed it off, but the idea stuck. From that day on, she started taking more interest in my health, checking in more often, asking about medications, offering to drive me to appointments I hadn't mentioned needing help with. It looked like care. It felt like concern. But there was a rhythm to it, too consistent, too directed. And my son, he grew quieter. He stopped disagreeing with her altogether. Whenever I pushed back on anything, just gently, just conversationally, she'd smile and say, "Let's not stress, Dad." Always my stress, never hers. Always framed as protection. Years went by like that. Then I got sick. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just gradually. The kind of illness that shrinks your world without making noise. Fewer walks, more appointments, more pills lined up by the sink. That's when she became indispensable. She organized everything. She spoke to doctors. She explained things to my son, sometimes right in front of me, as if I weren't fully there. My son deferred to her completely. I don't think he noticed when that became the default. By the time I landed in that hospital bed, the one you heard about in the first chapter, she had already positioned herself as the decision maker. That didn't happen overnight. It happened because everyone else stepped back, including me. If you're still with me, pause for just a moment. Think about how many times in life control doesn't come from force, but from silence. And if this story feels real to you, make sure you stay until the end. The reckoning doesn't come fast, but it comes clean. Now let me tell you about the night she first stayed after visiting hours. Because that was the night I finally realized my illness wasn't the only thing putting me at risk. Hospitals have a way of telling the truth without ever saying it out loud. They don't come right out and tell you someone is dying, not at first. They use careful words instead. Complicated. Touch and go. We'll see how he responds. They speak in half sentences and measured pauses, as if death itself might be offended by direct language. But then there comes a night when the language changes. I remember that night because the room felt different long before anyone spoke. The air was heavier, the voices lower. Conversations happened just outside the door instead of at my bedside. I couldn't see much, but I could hear everything. A doctor cleared his throat. I recognized his voice by then. Middle-aged, efficient. Never wasted syllables. "He's stable for now," he said. Then came the pause. "The next 24 hours will tell us more." That sentence has weight. Anyone who's spent time in a hospital knows it. My son asked the question everyone is afraid to ask. "So, what are we talking about? Days? Weeks?" Another pause. "Longer this time. We're doing what we can," the doctor said carefully. "But you should prepare yourselves. Prepare yourselves." My daughter-in-law exhaled loudly like she'd been holding her breath for hours and was finally allowed to release it. She asked about procedures, about resuscitation, about what would happen if things went the other way. She didn't ask whether I was in pain. She didn't ask whether I could hear. That's when I understood something important. She wasn't grieving yet. She was planning. Visiting hours ended shortly after. Nurses gently guided others away. The hallway emptied. Lights dimmed. The hospital slid into its nighttime version of itself, quiet, watchful, almost reverent. My son lingered. He didn't want to leave. I could hear it in his voice when he said goodnight, leaning over my bed, resting his hand on my arm. "I'm here, Dad," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." I believed him. I really did. But belief and reality don't always travel together. When he stepped away, my daughter-in-law stayed behind. "I'll keep an eye on him," she said to the nurse. Her voice was calm, confident, familiar. No one questioned it. Why would they? She was family. She'd been everywhere lately, signing forms, answering questions, acting like she belonged. The door closed, and for the first time since I'd been admitted, we were alone. No monitors had been muted. No machines stopped. The room still hummed with artificial life, but something else filled the silence now. Expectation. She didn't speak right away. She stood near the window for a moment, arms crossed, looking out at the city lights. When she finally turned back toward me, her face had settled into something neutral. Not cruel, not kind, just resolved. "You know," she said softly, "this is the hard part for families. Families." She pulled up a chair and sat beside my bed. Not close enough to touch, close enough to be heard. "My mother died in a hospital like this," she continued. "Long, drawn-out thing. Everyone said it was better to let nature take its course. Nature." I wanted to laugh at that. There was nothing natural about the wires feeding into me, the tube in my nose, the machine dictating my breath. But I stayed still. She leaned back in the chair and crossed her legs. "Dragging things out just makes it harder on everyone," she said. "On doctors, on family, on people who have to pick up the pieces afterward." Afterward. She glanced at the monitor, then back at my face. Her eyes lingered longer this time, searching for something: movement, recognition, resistance. She didn't find any, or at least she didn't think she did. "You wouldn't want to be a burden," she said, almost kindly. "You were never that kind of man." That one landed, because it was true. I'd spent my entire life trying not to be a burden to anyone. I'd worked long past when I had to. I'd handled my own affairs. I'd stayed quiet when I was sick so others wouldn't worry. She knew exactly which buttons to press. That's how I realized this wasn't impulsive. This was rehearsed. At some point, footsteps approached the room. My heart lifted slightly, until I recognized my son's steps. He hovered in the doorway. "I forgot my jacket," he muttered. She stood quickly, smile back in place. "He's resting," she said gently. "I'll stay." My son hesitated. He looked between us, at me, motionless, at her, composed. Something flickered across his face. Doubt, maybe, or guilt, but he said nothing. He left, and the door closed again. This time she moved closer, close enough that I felt her presence like pressure against my chest, close enough that her voice dropped, intimate, private. "They think you're comfortable," she whispered. "They think you can't hear a thing." She paused, watching for a reaction. I gave her none. "That's probably better," she continued. "Some things are easier when there's no audience." That word again. Audience. She reached out, not to touch me, but to rest her fingers lightly on the bed rail. "Testing. Everyone's tired," she said. "And sometimes letting go is the kindest thing." Kind. There it was. The justification. The moral wrapping around something ugly. I realized then that she wasn't talking to me. She was talking past me, explaining herself, making peace with what she'd already decided. If you're still listening, and I know some of you are listening late at night, take a moment here. Ask yourself how many times you've seen someone explain something that didn't need explaining. People only justify themselves when they're crossing a line. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to pause. Let me know where you're listening from, your city, your country. Stories like this cross borders because silence does. And if you want to see how this ends, how choices made in quiet rooms don't stay quiet forever, stay with me. That night wasn't loud. There was no shouting, no struggle anyone could hear. Just a woman who thought the room belonged to her, and a man everyone believed was already gone. There is a moment when you are very sick, where the world stops treating you like a person and starts treating you like an outcome. I had felt it creeping in for days, in the way conversations shifted slightly to the side of my bed instead of directly over it, in the way questions were asked about me instead of to me, in the way my name was slowly replaced with him. That night the shift completed itself. When the door closed behind my son, the room did not immediately grow tense. It grew still, the way a lake goes still before something breaks the surface. My daughter-in-law didn't speak for a while. She stood there listening to the machines, to the hallway, to the silence itself. I could feel her waiting for something, a sound, an interruption, a reason to stop. None came. She exhaled through her nose and moved closer to the bed. This time there was no chair, no distance, no pretense of conversation. She leaned in, resting her hand lightly on the edge of the mattress like it belonged there, like she belonged there. "You know," she said softly, "when people are this far gone, doctors don't always say it out loud." I could hear her breathing now, calm, steady. "They talk about chances," she continued, "percentages, hope." She gave a quiet, humorless laugh. "Hope is a strange thing. It keeps people holding on even when there's nothing left to hold on to." She didn't sound cruel. That was the most frightening part. She sounded practical. I lay there, trapped inside my own body, aware of every word and unable to react. I wanted to blink harder, to move a finger, to force some sign of life into the room, but my body stayed still, obedient to the lie everyone believed. She lowered her voice even more. "Everyone thinks this part is about kindness," she said, But it's really about timing. Timing. She reached toward my face, not abruptly, not dramatically, just slowly enough to feel intentional. Her fingers brushed against the tubing near my cheek, the thin line that delivered what my lungs no longer managed on their own. She didn't tug. She didn't adjust it. She simply rested her fingertips there, as if testing whether she could. I felt my heart push harder against my ribs. The monitor responded quietly. A subtle change. Nothing that would draw attention. She noticed it. Her eyes flicked to the screen, then back to me. "You see," she murmured, still reacting. "Your body doesn't want to let go." She sighed, as if disappointed, not angry, not rushed. "Tiring, isn't it?" she said, fighting something that's already decided. She leaned closer, and this time she spoke directly to me. "They won't blame me," she whispered. "No one ever blames the person who stays behind. They blame sickness, time, fate." Her grip tightened slightly. Not around the tube itself, but close enough that the meaning was unmistakable. "I want you to understand something here. This wasn't a sudden decision. This wasn't panic. This wasn't desperation. This was permission. Permission she had quietly given herself over months, maybe years, as she learned how much control she could take without anyone pushing back." I heard footsteps pass the door, a cart rolling by, a murmur of voices somewhere down the hall. She paused, listened, then she leaned in close enough that I felt her breath against my face. "Stop pretending," she said. Her voice was flat now, done with explanations. "Die quietly." She acted then, not violently, not dramatically. No struggle anyone would imagine. Just a quick, practiced movement that told me she had already pictured this moment before. The world changed immediately. There was no pain at first, just confusion, like stepping into water colder than expected. My chest tried to pull in air, and something wasn't there anymore. My body responded before my mind could. The machine changed its rhythm. I wanted to scream. I wanted to thrash. I wanted to do anything that would make noise. Instead, I lay there, fully conscious, feeling my body begin to panic in ways I could not control. My chest strained. My heart hammered. My vision dimmed at the edges, not from darkness but from pressure. I was still aware enough to see her face. She didn't look frantic. She looked irritated. "Please," she whispered, "just let it happen." Behind her I heard movement. Not fast, not alarmed. The door opened. For one terrible second I thought it might be my son. That thought hurt more than anything else. But the voice that followed wasn't his. It was calm, firm, female. "I've seen enough." My daughter-in-law froze. The room seemed to snap back into focus all at once. Footsteps crossed the threshold. The lights brightened slightly as someone reached for the panel near the door. The pressure on my chest eased as quickly as it had begun. A button was pressed. A protocol engaged. Hands that knew exactly what to do moved with practiced certainty. The machine adjusted, compensating instantly, like it had been waiting for permission to intervene. Someone leaned over me. Someone who spoke to me, not around me. "Sir, stay with us," she said, steady and controlled. "You're not alone." I was breathing again. My daughter-in-law stepped back as if she'd been pushed. She started. The surgeon cut her off. "Step away from the bed," she said. No emotion, no argument. My son appeared in the doorway seconds later, confusion written all over his face. "What's going on?" he asked. No one answered him right away, because some truths take a moment to land. As alarms remained silent and the room settled back into order, I lay there gasping softly, heart still racing but alive, very much alive. And for the first time since I'd been admitted, the people in the room were looking at her instead of me. She had believed silence was on her side. She had believed I was already gone. That belief was about to cost her everything. What most people don't understand about hospitals is this: nothing important ever truly happens in isolation. There are cameras you don't notice, sensors you forget about, logs that keep time better than memory ever could, and there are people, quiet, trained, unshakable, whose job is to step in the moment something crosses from unfortunate into unacceptable. When the surgeon said, "I've seen enough," she wasn't guessing. She wasn't reacting emotionally. She was concluding something. I could feel it in the way the room shifted. Not panicked, not loud, controlled, precise, the kind of energy that enters when professionals stop observing and start documenting. "Who touched the patient?" she asked. Her voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. My daughter-in-law stood frozen near the foot of the bed, hands hovering uselessly at her sides like she hadn't yet decided what expression to wear. She glanced at my son, then back at the surgeon. "I was just trying to help," she said quickly. Too quickly. He was uncomfortable. That was the wrong answer. The surgeon didn't look at her. She looked at the monitor, at the tubing, at the timestamp blinking steadily in the corner of the screen. "You altered life support equipment," she said flatly. "That's not comfort." She turned to the nurse who'd entered with her. "Secure the room," she said. My son swallowed hard. I heard it clearly. He stepped forward instinctively, hands raised slightly, the way men do when they think explanation might fix something that has already passed the point of explanation. "There has to be some misunderstanding," he said. His voice shook. "My wife wouldn't," the surgeon cut him off without even looking. "Sir," she said, "you need to step back." Those 4 words changed the room more than anything else that night. Because for the first time, my son wasn't being deferred to. He wasn't being listened to. He was being managed. A second nurse entered, then a third. Quiet efficiency, no raised voices, no chaos, just professionals moving with the certainty of people who had seen this kind of thing before. Because they had. I lay there breathing hard now, lungs burning slightly, heart still racing, but stabilizing. My body knew when help had arrived. The surgeon leaned close enough that I could hear her clearly. "You're safe," she said. "You're not alone. You did nothing wrong. Nothing wrong." I wanted to tell her I was aware the whole time, that I'd heard every word, that I'd felt the moment my body started to slip. But even then, my strength wasn't back yet. I stayed still and listened. My daughter-in-law tried to reposition herself emotionally. You could see it happening, a calculated shift. She stepped closer to my son, her voice softening. "I was scared," she said. "They told us you weren't going to make it. I didn't want him to suffer." Her hand reached for my son's sleeve. He didn't pull away. That hurt more than I expected. But the surgeon wasn't interested in their dynamic. She gestured toward the ceiling, toward a corner of the room I'd never paid attention to. "ICU rooms are under continuous monitoring," she said, audio included. Silence. Not stunned silence, dead silence. My daughter-in-law's face emptied out in real time. Not fear yet, calculation collapsing. "What?" my son said. The surgeon's voice remained steady, factual. "Video and audio feeds," she repeated, continuous, logged, stored. She took a tablet from the nurse beside her and tapped the screen twice, once to unlock, once to replay. I heard my own breathing first, then her voice, "Stop pretending, die quietly." The words filled the room, thin and unmistakable. My son staggered backward like someone had shoved him. That's not," he started. The surgeon lifted a hand. "There's more." The sound changed slightly as the recording progressed. The subtle shift in my breathing. The absence where something vital should have been. The nurse beside her spoke quietly. "Timestamp matches the drop in oxygen saturation." That was the moment the tone changed completely. No one was speculating anymore. "This constitutes intentional interference with life-sustaining treatment," the surgeon said. "Without consent, without authority." She turned to my daughter-in-law. "You are no longer allowed near this patient." Security arrived shortly after. Not rushing, not dramatic. 2 people in dark uniforms, guided by gestures, not arguments. One of them addressed her directly. "Ma'am, you need to step into the hallway." My daughter-in-law looked at my son. For the first time, her expression cracked. "Say something," she pleaded quietly. "Tell them they're misunderstanding." My son didn't move, didn't speak. He stood there, pale and hollow, watching a version of his life unravel that he'd allowed to build unchecked. She was escorted out. Not arrested. Not yet. But she was done in that room. The door closed behind her with a sound far softer than I would have expected. The surgeon turned to my son then, really looked at him for the first time. "Sir," she said, "you were present?" He nodded, barely. "And you heard what was said?" Another nod. She didn't accuse him. She didn't threaten him. She didn't need to. She just said, "You should speak to counsel." Then she turned back to me. "We'll be documenting everything," she said. "You will not be left alone." When the room finally quieted again, it was different now. Not tense, resolved. Machines hummed steadily. Nurses adjusted things with care. Someone dimmed the lights just enough to let the night settle without hiding anything. My son stood by the wall, staring at the floor like a man waking from a long, deliberate sleep. He finally spoke. "I didn't think she would." His voice broke. "I didn't think it would go that far. I wanted to tell him something. I wanted to tell him this didn't start tonight. That it never starts at the worst moment. It starts when someone learns they can cross small lines without consequence." Instead, I closed my eyes for the first time since being admitted, not from weakness but from exhaustion, because I knew something he didn't yet understand. The hospital had done its part. Now it was my turn. People imagine justice as something loud. They think it arrives with shouting, handcuffs, raised voices, maybe a dramatic confession. That's not how it happens, not when it's real. Real justice comes through paperwork, timestamps, signatures, and people who no longer need your permission to act. The night she was removed from my room, the hospital didn't sleep. I could hear it in the movement outside my door, the shift changes that didn't follow their usual rhythm, the murmured conversations that happened in corners instead of hallways, the quiet urgency of systems that had already decided this was no longer just a medical situation. By morning, everything had changed. A woman introduced herself as part of risk management. She didn't sit. She stood at the foot of my bed with a folder tucked under her arm and a tablet in her other hand. Calm voice, neutral face, eyes that did not miss detail. She asked me questions slowly. Could I hear voices during the incident? Did I understand what was being said at the time? Did I feel physical distress when the oxygen was removed? I answered every one, not emotionally, not angrily, clearly, because clarity is what turns suspicion into record. When my son walked in later that day, he didn't recognize the room anymore. There were more people, more notes being taken, more glances at him that lingered a second too long. He stopped just inside the doorway. "Dad," he said. I didn't answer right away. I was watching his posture. His shoulders were slumped now, not in grief but in something heavier, realization creeping in too late. He tried again. I didn't know it would come to this. I looked at him then, really looked at him. "You knew enough," I said. The words came out steady. That surprised him. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then finally said what he'd been circling since the night before. "She said you were suffering," he murmured. "She said the doctors thought it was only a matter of time." "I was still alive," I replied. That should have been the end of the conversation. He flinched. That was the first crack. Later that afternoon, a doctor, not the surgeon from the night before, sat with me and explained what was already happening. The incident had been classified as intentional interference with life-sustaining treatment. Internal reports were filed. The recordings were preserved. External authorities had been notified. Not asked, not invited. Notified. When people talk about pressing charges, they imagine it as a choice, something you weigh emotionally. This was no longer about what I wanted. This was about what had been done. My daughter-in-law tried calling that evening. The nurse intercepted the phone before I ever heard it ring. "She's not approved for contact," she said simply. I nodded. That was policy. The next morning, my son arrived with red eyes and a stack of papers under his arm. He looked like a man who hadn't slept, not from grief, but from fear of what daylight would bring. "She got a lawyer," he said quietly. I didn't respond. "She says it was a misunderstanding," he continued. "That she panicked. That she thought it was what you'd want." I turned my head slightly toward him. "Did you believe her?" I asked. He didn't answer. That was enough. Here's the part people don't like hearing. Betrayal is rarely committed alone. Someone always stands nearby and says nothing. In the days that followed, information moved faster than emotion ever could. Hospital administrators requested formal statements. Law enforcement interviewed staff. The audio was transcribed. The video reviewed frame by frame. Every whisper, every movement, every second. And every time my son sat through another meeting, another explanation, another quiet reading of facts, he shrank. Not because people were yelling at him, because no one was protecting him anymore. One afternoon I asked to speak to him privately. They allowed it, but a staff member stayed within range. The door didn't close all the way. He stood at the side of the bed like a child caught doing something irreversible. "I never thought she could hurt you," he said. "I thought she was just handling things." I held his gaze. "That's what you let yourself believe," I said, "because believing anything else would have required you to stop her." His eyes filled. "I loved her." "I know," I replied. "That doesn't change what you allowed." He sank into the chair beside the bed. "What happens now?" he asked. The question wasn't about me. It was about him. "Now," I said, "you live with the truth." The truth was already spreading beyond the hospital. My daughter-in-law was barred from the premises. A formal no-contact order followed soon after. Not from me, but from the state. Her carefully cultivated image fractured quickly once procedure replaced storytelling. People don't react kindly to recordings. They don't debate tone when the words are clear. My son began receiving messages from family. Some supportive, some accusing, some simply confused. For years she had spoken for both of them. Now he had to answer questions alone. That night I made a decision. Not out of anger, out of clarity. I asked my attorney, yes, I'd kept one long before this, to initiate changes. Immediate ones. Medical proxy revoked. Power of attorney canceled. Updated directives filed and notarized. When my son was informed of this, he didn't protest. He just nodded. "I understand," he said. That might have been the saddest part. Understanding after the damage was done. By the end of the week, charges were no longer hypothetical. Investigators described them in measured terms. No dramatics, no moral language, just statutes and consequences. My daughter-in-law stopped calling after that. She didn't need to. Everything she'd thought was private wasn't. Everything she'd believed she controlled slipped away. And my son, he stayed away longer now. Not because he was unwelcome, but because facing me meant facing what he'd lost. In one silent week he lost his wife, his role as protector, and the future he'd assumed would arrive automatically. I lay there listening to the machines again. Still breathing, still here. And for the first time since this began, the room felt honest. It's a strange thing watching someone lose control in reverse. Most people imagine destruction as a sudden event, a blow-up, a public scene, something loud enough to confirm that it's happening. But real collapse doesn't announce itself. It unfolds piece by piece, quietly, while the person at the center keeps insisting they're still standing. My daughter-in-law didn't disappear after the hospital incident. She tried to manage it. That was her mistake. The first sign was the silence, the kind of silence that comes from doors quietly closing, not slamming, not shouting, just refusing to open again. She learned quickly which numbers no longer answered her calls, which emails received automated replies, which conversations ended after one sentence. She was no longer being handled. She was being processed. The investigation moved forward without her participation. It didn't need her cooperation. It already had what it required: time-stamped audio, video, witness statements, medical data that did not care how well she explained herself. Intent doesn't argue with recordings. Within days, her attorney stopped speaking in hopeful language. Within a week, he stopped offering reassurance at all. The charges weren't framed emotionally. They never are. They were defined clinically: interference with medical treatment, reckless endangerment, intentional harm under vulnerable circumstances. Words heavy enough to reshape a life. People asked me how I felt about it. I didn't feel anything dramatic. I felt finished. Finished pretending this was a misunderstanding. Finished wondering how it could have gone differently. Finished protecting people who had decided I was expendable. My son came less often during that time. When he did, he looked like someone who'd aged years and days. He spoke slower, asked fewer questions. He'd stopped defending her, not because he'd had a moral epiphany, but because the weight of evidence had made defense impossible. That's something I want to be clear about. Real remorse doesn't come from being cornered. It comes from recognition. He hadn't recognized anything yet. He just couldn't deny it anymore. The legal repercussions escalated quickly once the case left the hospital's internal system. When authority shifts hands, it does so completely. The district attorney's office reviewed the footage. Independent specialists examined the medical data. Statements were cross-referenced. Her words, "die quietly," became a line item, a measurable action. Consequences followed. Her workplace placed her on immediate suspension pending outcome. Professional affiliations distanced themselves. People she'd once impressed with polished conversation and curated empathy began to remember earlier moments they'd dismissed. The impatience, the subtle control, the way she always positioned herself at the center of decision-making. Power doesn't evaporate. It gets withdrawn. The court issued a formal protective order barring her from any proximity to me. She was no longer allowed to contact my physicians, review my records, or speak on my behalf, rights she'd assumed were permanent. They weren't. My son tried to reconcile with her at first. Not publicly. Quietly. He believed or wanted to believe that there was still a version of her that hadn't crossed the line, that if he spoke to her privately, he'd find some explanation that made everything survivable. That conversation did not go the way he hoped. He told me about it later, his voice hollow, as if he were reciting something he still couldn't fully believe. "She says you exaggerated," he said. "She says the hospital manipulated the footage. She says if I stand by her, we can get through this." I looked at him for a long time before responding. "And what did she say about taking responsibility?" I asked. He didn't answer. That silence told me everything. This is the part most people don't like accepting. Some people don't regret what they did. They regret that it didn't work. That's who she was. When the indictment became public record, the story spread faster than she could contain it. Not through gossip, through official channels, court calendars, legal filings, news briefs that didn't editorialize, didn't speculate. They simply stated facts. My name appeared in documents without commentary. My age, my condition, the event, the recordings. I remained in the hospital during much of this, regaining strength slowly, deliberately. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had tried to erase me quietly, and instead made me visible in ways I'd never sought. My son attended one preliminary hearing without her. He sat in the gallery, not at counsel's table. That mattered. He came back to the hospital afterward and stood at the foot of my bed like someone waiting for a sentence to be handed down. "They're saying she could go to prison," he said. I nodded once. "That's how consequences work," I replied. He hesitated, then asked the question he'd been avoiding for weeks. "What about me?" I didn't answer immediately. There is a moment in every parent's life when you realize your job is no longer to protect your child. It's to stop protecting their excuses. "You were there," I said finally. "You heard her." "I didn't stop her," he whispered. "That's correct." His shoulders collapsed inward. "I was afraid," he said. "I didn't want to lose her." "You lost me instead," I replied. That one broke him. He sank into the chair again, face in his hands, and cried in a way I hadn't seen since he was a child. But the difference now was this. I didn't move to comfort him, because comfort without accountability is just permission with better lighting. "I don't know how to fix this," he said. "You don't," I replied. "You live with it." I told him then, calmly, clearly, what I had already set into motion. He was no longer my medical proxy. He was no longer named in my will as primary beneficiary. Any decisions regarding my care or assets would be handled by people whose judgment had not already failed me. I wasn't disowning him, but I was done trusting him. That distinction matters. He didn't argue. He simply nodded. Sometimes acceptance isn't growth. It's surrender. By the time I was discharged, my daughter-in-law's public image had been dismantled by facts alone. No commentary, no character assassination. Just the truth, unadorned. She hadn't been framed. She hadn't been misunderstood. She'd been recorded, and my son had become collateral in a war he refused to fight until it was already over. I walked, slowly, carefully, out of the hospital doors weeks later, alive in a way that felt newly intentional. Behind me, a system continued its work. Ahead of me, only one thing remained unsettled. There's a moment after the worst is over when people expect relief to rush in. They expect vindication to feel warm. They expect survival to feel like victory. They expect justice to feel satisfying. It doesn't. It feels quiet. By the time the case reached sentencing, my body had recovered enough to carry me into the courtroom on my own. Slowly, carefully. No machines, no tubes, just my weight, my breath, and the steady reminder that I had not died when someone wanted me to. I sat in the front row. I was not required to be there. No one asked me to come. But I wanted the record to reflect something simple. I was alive. She didn't look at me when she entered. People expect guilt to look dramatic. Tears, collapse, apologies. They've watched too many movies. What I saw instead was irritation. She was irritated that this had gone so far. Irritated that people were watching. Irritated that control had slipped through her fingers and shattered on the floor where everyone could see it. Her attorney spoke in practiced phrases. Stress, misunderstanding, no prior record. Words designed to soften edges that recordings had already hardened. Then the prosecutor spoke. They didn't raise their voice. They didn't moralize. They didn't need to. They played the audio. Again. Stop pretending. Die quietly. Hearing it in a courtroom stripped away any remaining ambiguity. This wasn't a moment. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't panic. It was intent. She finally looked at me then. Not with remorse, with calculation. I met her eyes and didn't look away. That was the last moment of power she ever had over me. The sentence wasn't theatrical. It was appropriate, measured, unforgiving. She was convicted. She was barred from contact with vulnerable individuals. She lost her career, permanently. She was sentenced to time she would spend thinking, without anyone rushing to explain things away for her. When the gavel struck, no one gasped. The sound was small, final. My son sat behind me, alone. She didn't look at him once. That told me everything I needed to know. Afterward, people asked if I felt closure. That word gets used too easily. Closure suggests something has been neatly wrapped, tied off, stored away. This wasn't that. This was consequence. I saw my son one last time a week later. No lawyers, no hospital rooms, no paperwork, just a quiet coffee shop where neither of us belonged anymore. He looked older, smaller. I don't expect forgiveness, he said quickly. I just needed to see you. I listened. That mattered. I didn't protect you, he continued. I chose comfort over responsibility. I let someone hurt you because it was easier than confronting her. I nodded. He waited. I said nothing. I don't know how to live with that, he admitted. I finally spoke. You don't get to live it down, I said. You live with it. His face crumpled slightly at that, not from anger but from understanding. I've changed the will, I continued. You already know that. Yes, he said. This isn't revenge, I added. It's consequence. Trust doesn't regenerate just because blood says it should. He swallowed. I don't expect anything from you, he said. Good, I replied. Because expectations are what got us here. That was the last conversation we had as father and son, in the way he understood it. I didn't disown him. I didn't dramatize it. I simply stepped back and let adulthood do what it's supposed to do. I went home. Not to the house she had planned around, not to the future she had assumed, but to a quiet life rebuilt on clarity. I appointed people who had proven they would act when things became uncomfortable. I rewrote every document. I removed every assumption, and I slept. For the first time in years, I slept without machines, without fear, without wondering who was waiting for me not to wake up. You want to know the truth? Survival wasn't the victory. Being believed was. The system worked, not because it's perfect, but because someone spoke at the right moment, and evidence does not forget. She believed silence was her ally. She believed weakness was invisible. She believed age made me expendable. She was wrong. I lived, and everything she tried to take from me took her instead.